What's up, fellow gamers? Phreak here. I'm the design lead of Summoner's Rift Team's live pod, here to talk about patch 13.24. This is the last major patch of the year. 14.1 comes in January with the new seasonal update. We plan on making a 13.24b patch in about 1 week's time, unless we cannot find anything worth rebalancing or retuning at that point in time. Not certain, although regardless, we are trying to budget that into our planning for the end of this week and the start of next week to put together a patch if there are any balance outliers. If we overswung or underswung in this patch and need to do something else, then we will do that. Otherwise, though, of course, it is the end of the season. Ranked ladder ends in early January. Basically, I think it's the day before the patch goes out for 14.1. So good luck getting to your rank goals and all that. Let's talk about this patch itself. This is a cool feature getting added for a cast at max range toggle. Feel free to read about this if you want. Hui comes out. This is very exciting as well. This champion is really, really cool. Expect to see him in your games quite a lot. I think this champion's really sweet. Overall cool stuff here. Let's talk about the actual balance changes, though. Up first is Azir. He got changes in the previous patch that made his W now apply on hit effects like Nashor's Tooth. Players seemed to want to build the item anyway. Now it works the way people think intuitively that it does, and so he applies on hit effects. I did the dev work on this patch update, and basically what I did is I wrote it here. I looked at how his various Nashor's builds were doing. They lost around 0.3% win rate, and so I tried to add about 0.3% win rate back via this change. Now, of course, the fact that Shadow Flame builds were more performant in the patch before means he probably lost more than this in actual win rate. So it might be that Azir needs more buffs than this, but regardless, since Nashor's Tooth gives him an extra AP ratio and it gives him extra base damage at 2 items when he buys it, I decided to buff back the early game that was nerfed before he builds Nashor's Tooth. It could be he should get a little bit more power here as well, or maybe the ratio back or something else, but essentially trying to walk back the thing that Nashor's Tooth couldn't replace, which was early game damage, to try to make sure his autos still feel pretty solid in the early game. Again, could be convinced that this is not enough here. Regardless, some small buffs to Azir. Next are 2 sets of changes to Braum. One is some more baseline mana regen. Second is some overall knockup duration on his R. Any secondary target is just strictly double the duration. The minimum knockup duration, basically the way this ability works, is it interpolates from melee range to when you actually hit the target for your first target, somewhere between 0.3 and 1 to 1.5 based on rank, how much you're going to knock up this champion. I think it might be actually 1 to 2 based on rank, or whatever, it doesn't matter. Anyway, it interpolates how long the knockup's going to be based on your distance to that champion. So if you're in melee range, it's twice the knockup duration. If you're at max range, there is no buff here at all. But essentially says, yeah, Braum R is going to feel better overall as a spell. Now this, to be fair, is a pretty scary lever. Braum R... This got changed from a basically always max duration stun in melee range to the shape it is now, because this champ used to be pro-jailed as good into all the engaged tanks while still being a good Flash R engaged tank himself. And so specifically to nerf the Flash R engages, we are walking this back some, which I think will feel very good for Braum, but it does risk putting him back in pro-jail. This is a very sensitive lever. It's one that we might walk back if we get back to Braum as #1 champ in pro play with a 50.5% win rate in solo queue. This means that we have to go back on at least some of the R and find something else to give him. So just kind of forewarned about this. A lot of logic behind the mana regen change was simply to soften Braum's matchups overall. I think in general, and to be clear, not in every case, but in general, I think League could do with slightly softer lane matchups. Not that champs can't be good or bad in lane overall, but something like Sylas Malphite is so incredibly impossible to play on the Malphite side and is so incredibly good for Sylas that it's like, oh my gosh, you basically cannot blind Malphite until you see their jungler and both solos, and then maybe even their support as well, because support Sylas is also really good. And it's like, that level of pressure is probably too high. Anyway, this is to say that Braum is pretty bad into ranged matchups, and softening that a little bit is probably valuable here, because there is a swath of lanes that Braum is quite bad at. Flashbang warning as we go over to the data tables. So here is how much mana regen per minute Braum has as a result of this change, and then here is how much mana Braum has over the course of 4 minutes. Of course, you don't hit level like 13 very often in support, so really around here that you're actually interacting with. And yeah, Braum has a solid amount of extra mana to spend in the laning phase, around 50 in any 4-minute situation, which is basically about 1 to 2 extra spells, which is not nothing. It's not huge. We're not going for 4% win rate buff on Braum, but it's meant to feel kind of nice. Next, a set of changes to Brier. Brier not only has the steepest master curve we've ever seen for any champion in League of Legends history, but also as players shift over to her lethality build, they are gaining win rate there as well. I think ideally, lethality Brier and fighter Brier would be similar in power level, such that she's happy to choose between the high-risk early game fall-off lethality build or a more mellowed out for, relative to Brier, smoother power curve where she's okay being a little bit of frontline, a little bit more disruption overall. But right now, these builds are so far apart in power, there's no reason to go anything but lethality, so we'd like to close that gap somewhat. Lower base armor, the theory goes that the less of a stat you have, the more you want it, so the fewer durability stats Brier has, the more she wants to buy durability. Attack speed ratio is being increased from 644 to 669. Her level 1 attack speed is being unchanged at 644. Want to note that the unofficial wiki has this as a typo. Her level 1 AS is and has been 644. If anyone wants to go in and fix that, feel free. Regardless, this is paired with her W being nerfed by 5% attack speed. What this means is when you're not in W, you have higher attack speed and you have more appetite for bonus attack speed, which are items like Trinity Force, which is rare, Bork, which is not very good on her, but Stride Breaker, which is a pretty good fighter item on her. There are fighter items with attack speed. There are not lethality items with attack speed, so giving her a little bit more attack speed appetite is useful. Blood Frenzy is basically treads water almost exactly, accounting for the ratio change. A little bit of less base damage on Head Rush says, okay, lethality has a little bit less base damage to multiply against. Fighter doesn't multiply this in any meaningful way, so there's less to look at there. Less damage reduction on E. The theory is that fighter Brier doesn't need this as a parry, whereas lethality certainly does because she has no bonus durability. That said, there is a health ratio nerf here, which is maybe a light nerf to fighter Brier more so than lethality, but it's a pretty small one overall. And then certain death being converted from physical damage to magic damage, but because changing from physical to magic damage is generically a buff, there is an AD ratio nerf from 0.75 to 0.5. That's a lot of changes. Let's do the math. So first up, here is the expected number of attacks per second from Brier. This is just baseline, walking around, punching monsters. You're not running any attack speed shards or anything. You're just hitting stuff, and it's very, very little. But this is functionally also, some level of what does our appetite look for, or what does our appetite look like for buying things like Stride Breaker. It's better and better since her ratio is higher overall. If you are during your W, rank 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, then 5. How good is this? And then, by the way, eventually you level up, and because we can see this cares about level, this also cares about level. Ultimately, this says, yes, actually your early clear is a little bit weaker. You have 2% less attack speed at level 1 when clearing. That is going to be true. That's going to be the case for you. And so you're not going to have quite the same dueling. And to be clear, this is very small, right? This is not a very large change. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to insinuate that it is. But to say, hey, it's a very, very small nerf up until you get to the point where you go into the late game, which is where fighter might shine more overall. But yes, it's a nerf to early dueling, and saying that, hey, more of your combat power is going to be maybe outside of the W, so you're going to be a little bit less burst based. It's not a huge change, but it does exist. Here is the expected damage out of the Q as a result of taking 5 to 20 damage off of it. There you go. And then here is with her -2 armor. Here is the expected physical durability of the champion as a result, and of course you can see it's about 1.5% less physical durability overall. Not a huge change, but it can matter some. This might increase the chance that someone can beat her back in the one-on-one. This combined with the E damage reduction being lower, there is a chance just maybe you can burst out lethality Brier and that build might lose a lot of power. I'm not really holding my breath here, but it at least nudges in that direction. And then here is the rough math on how much damage is coming out of Brier R. So this is a fighter build, as I mentioned before. Changing to magic damage will generally be a buff to fighter builds. This line is drawing where Black Cleaver shows up as the second item typically in a fighter build. I decided it was going to come in at level 13. So right here, you shred 5% of your target's armor. And this means that, hey, you know, right here, the switch to magic damage is slightly less of a buff than before. But to be clear, this is honestly strictly power positive to fighter Brier. And then over here is more what the math looks like for lethality Brier. This depends on the target. If you're hitting something like an Orianna or like Lucian in the bottom lane, it's going to be much more red than green. I'm basically using a fairly standard top lane or jungle champion, right? Fighters who are often build steel caps, have high decent armor growth and whatnot. So I'm picking a fairly middling to high end target, though to be clear, like not Ornn or Malphite. This is the line where Lord Dominus Regards comes in. It is Brier's most common third item. So saying, hey, we're really, really lowering the value of armor pen here in this champion, because again, clearly this is better looking for a fighter build than lethality build, but this is probably directly aimed after the champion. But to say that, yes, this is probably intended, this is probably correct, this is probably the right thing to do, to suggest that, hey, lethality is going to be less valuable here. We could do more. We can convert the Q to magic. We can convert the W to magic. We could maybe convert the path to magic. We can make the passive go twice per second so that it stacks cleaver faster to make sure she has better cleaver synergy. There's lots that could happen, but regardless, this is at least a nudge in several good directions. I think on a whole, this is power negative. This is power negative. This is absolutely power negative to lethality build. This is power negative to all builds, but I think especially lethality. This is, I would say, on a whole, power negative, although, you know, there's some wiggle room here because she's not always clearing under the effects of W and whatnot. And regardless, I think this is at least win rate negative to some degree, which is a good thing, and it should close the gap on the build, which is good as well. Galio is getting his third buff this year. We went to make his ulti better, to make sure he was good at being globals. We went, we buffed his W pass to make sure he was good as a magic damage tanker. I think that was worthwhile as well. And we definitely don't want Galio to be a safe wave clear bot, and we don't want Galio to be a burst mage. So cooldown makes this a more reasonable thing where he's not going to one-shot the wave, most likely, so it's going to require the second rotation anyway. But this helps ensure that Galio has stuff to do in a longer duration fight. I think the correct sort of combat pattern for a tank in League of Legends is it's weirdly kind of fighter-like in that ability ace is kind of like sort of a core stat, but they don't really increase their burst damage much. So I know Galio isn't a tank, but I'm just going to talk about tanks in general really, really briefly, which is they need to have something to do once the fight starts after they've like gone for their first set of cooldowns. And there's really good ones like Nautilus passive where you actually want to switch targets, put new things on. Braum passive works the same way. And even just the fact that like Braum E has a duration means he's got like 4 seconds of high mind share of trying to block the right projectiles and go in the right places and whatnot, and then go back to using his passive on stuff. Leona Q has a short cooldown of 5 seconds. Galio passive is short, but having another relatively short cooldown lets him just have things to do and things to care about in a team fight instead of like, well, I pressed my buttons, I landed the taunt, I used my passive auto once, and now got nothing to do. So, of course, it is important that we don't creep our cooldowns too short. But in general, I think fighters and tanks are probably the two classes who need short ability cooldowns or some kind of long duration effect that requires mindshare as they use it. Even the dot version of Nautilus W is kind of this. If the shield holds, you want to kind of spread the dot around, keep it up on people. There's a little bit there. So there are some really clever designs in tanks here, I think, in League of Legends. This is to say that I think Galio getting a cooldown buff here is pretty valuable. The numbers are nothing to be surprised about here. It's eventually a 20% cooldown buff on the Q, which is very, very nice. Good job, him. Similar in the case of Gragas. Gragas probably is happiest right now as a core jungler. The fact that he has fairly uninteractive wave clear. Q wants to cook against minions. Well, guess what? Minions don't run away. It's got a pretty solid AoE. Yes, we can keep nerfing this to like feel really, really bad hitting minions, but ultimately, like Gragas has really good wave clear. He has really, really good disengage. Unless we could make him like absolutely have to use E and W to be useful, and we made Q just like a 1-point wonder or something. We made him skirmish with you in melee range, and that would require some pretty substantial kit updates. Gragas just doesn't have a very healthy, ironic via the word, top lane laning phase pattern. Whereas in jungle, it's actually all pretty reasonable. Like, yes, his ganks are really good, sure, but whatever. So kind of saying that Gragas is the primary jungler, I think is actually kind of reasonable in the current kit shape, because I think there's a lot of flaws with his top lane, with his kit for top lane. Not to say that we couldn't buff Gragas, but just he basically just gets picked as like the default pro play weak side top laner, and it's just like the most boring thing because he cannot be punished. I'm actually very glad we nerfed the passive cooldown when we did, but as a designer who did this changes notes, wants to bring it back down so that as the game goes on, he's allowed to have access to this part of his kit again, which I think is very, very notable and worthwhile. So you don't get the old version of the cooldown back until level 11, which is pretty solidly like 1 item plus in the laning phase, so you cannot easily use Gragas as simple, free, weak side top laner, can't get pushed out of lane because he's keeping that long passive cooldown up until level 5. And it's still a fairly long cooldown at 6 through 10 there as well. So I think it's a very clever change. I think it's a good change. And to say that, yeah, you're not just going to stabilize any lane ever up in top lane, but eventually you get to use this as an active part of your tanking, which I think is totally reasonable and totally fine. So I think pretty solid change here. There was a nerf to Ivern. This champion is definitely incredibly performant. Ivern has one of the steepest mastery curves in League of Legends. Like, Brier is clear number 1, but Azir and Ivern are both top 5. The fact that Ivern is so solo queue performant despite a steep mastery curve means he's probably somewhat overtuned. He definitely is very performant in solo queue right now. That said, a jungler choosing to give up some agency to play a more supportive enchanter style jungler is probably a good thing. I think overall, Ivern being good is actually good for League of Legends, to be clear. But he's just simply too powerful, and so would like to bring Ivern down to a more normal level of power. It's worth noting that Ivern is somewhat elite skewed. We would like to do some elite skewed levers if possible then as a result. And overall, just lower his power level some. Once again, there's nothing meaningful with the math here, but it's minus 25 base health, which does not do a lot of heavy lifting for Ivern. This is more, I like to bring down outliers when possible. I brought down Ivern's magic just a while ago this year. Ivern used to be a melee champion, so he had melee champion health and armor and magic resist. And when Ivern became full-time ranged, this meant he had a combat pattern and shape and style more like Karma and less like, I don't know, Nautilus. And so I'm trying to basically move his stats to be closer to Karma's stats and less like Nautilus' stats. That's where the MR nerf came from a while ago. This is where the health nerf is coming from, and saying, look, happy to rebalance you wherever is needed, but hey, you don't need to be the tankiest enchanter by far. You don't need to ever be in melee range. Yes, you could deliver your E, but in the way that like Karma and Morgana occasionally walk into melee range, they have high for an enchanter durability. Ivern can have high for an enchanter durability, not highest for an enchanter durability, right? So kind of the nudge there. And of course, he also has Daisy to deliver the shield for him. So even compared to Morgana, he has even less reason to be in melee range. When they both have R, Morgana actually has to walk into melee range of you. Ivern can send Daisy. So this guy doesn't need to have privileged durability. I don't want to, undurability the game overall. I'm happy to give it out like candy when relevant. But there are also cases where I would actually like to see more differentiation between generic squishy and generic tanky champions. This is one of those cases. Basically, I'm just looking for win rate budget here. I thought this would do very little. The feedback I got was that this would be a fairly low impact lever. So we added 5% slow onto the E as well. He already has 2 other forms of crowd control that are unreliable. So we're nerfing his reliable crowd control so that he can rely more on the Q skill shot and the R setup there. Not much to say here, just meant to be some power negative for this champion. K'Sante, unfortunately, has been on an absolute balance roller coaster. That said, his current resting win rate is higher than it was back in 13.19. So even in this, to be fair, I think over nerf state of K'Sante, his average performance is better than it was before the update, and his popularity is higher than it was before the update. Those are both successful things. Now, I expect his popularity to wane as he is in probably a 2-week state now that he is a bit more fair using his W. And we are trying to preserve that K'Sante has some Bad matchups where his tools aren't very good and he's very counterpickable. K'Sante has largely been pro-jailed. In the past, it would be nice to undo that. I think we have done some pretty good work to undo the pro-jailing, and now it's just a matter of getting K'Sante's overall tuning into the right state. Again, current K'Sante is a little bit too weak. We are going intentionally a little bit light here, but trying to pick the correct levers here. So what we're trying to do is W is his sort of like very fair ability, and from the data we have collected, W as an overall output of a skill is low elo skewed. W is low elo skewed, Q is high elo skewed. And we like the new W we gave him. We think it's a good skill. We think it adds skill expression to him and skill expression for his opponents, which is good, considering how much agency K'Sante often has in his matchups. And so, okay, well, more of your power budget is in this known low elo skewed ability. And it's also the fact that the W, of course, has room for a lot of counterplay in the hands of highly skilled players, but also in the hands of certain matchups. Fiora's true damage perfectly pierces through the W damage reduction. Camille's the Q2 true damage, her backflip. Precision Protocol, like that also pierces damage reduction. Cool, K'Sante can have some weak matchups where, his opponents don't care anymore. Jax can potentially use his E and say, go ahead and W into me. I'm going to dodge your passive auto, and then I'll trade you back once the spell is done. Do you want to W backwards? Go for it. My cooldown's shorter. K'Sante having weak matchups into fighters who can deal with this tool. I mean, Fiora, if she doesn't, lose the mind game, could just parry this and make him W backwards, or he has it correctly and just turns this into a stun. Like, it's important that K'Sante has some sharp matchups. This helps us not have him be pro-jailed. And so by putting more of his power budget into W, that's kind of the logic here. The second thing we are doing is increasing the gold scaling of this champion to further increase the context around K'Sante games. Of course, a lot of K'Sante's damage is spoken for. This base damage doesn't care how well you're doing. The total AD ratio doesn't care how well you're doing unless you're in All Out, which, All Out gains more AD based on bonus armor MR, which is really subtle overall, and then there's only a 50% ratio, and it's this barely has an All Out armor MR ratio. So, okay, there's a part of the damage that, to be fair, is actually relatively light. A very small portion of W's damage is the gold scaling of the bonus armor MR ratio. Oh yeah, also targets max health. Again, you're gonna get this no matter what. It doesn't matter how well you're last hitting or how much you're stuck under turret here. So trying to say, okay, well, also, one of your primary damage tools is going to have more context around how well you are doing. All this to say that Pathmaker is the larger portion of his power budget, and it cares about how well he's doing, so that in bad matchups, he maybe can't access all the power. Here is the math on how much K'Sante he's going to do. So this is accounting for him getting to roughly 4 items across the entire game, and using a fairly standard melee top laner as his example target. And what you can see here is once you hit first recall at level 4, the damage is up a very, very small amount in your landing phase, but about 5 to maybe 15%. And if you can ever go to a 6th item, it goes higher, but about 5 to 50% more damage in laning phase Ws. This is a pretty decent damage buff. This is a decent portion of his damage overall. It's a solid increase. Of course, he uses the spell during All Out as well, because essentially All Out is a flat damage gain. The relative value of the 50% armor MR ratio is lower, although the additive damage difference is still 34 in each case. 34 damages means less in All Out than before. Of course, yep, W is still a high damage ability. It's meant to have a telegraph. It's meant to be counterplayable. It is. So, yep, this is the push here, trying to push the shape towards abilities that have counterplay, and hopefully closing some of the MMR gap, closing some of the pro-jail gap. That would be ideal. Next is a change, well, a set of changes to Leona. We are giving her both a mix of more damage and more durability overall. I mentioned trying to not just damage creep or durability uncreep the game. So in the case of Leona, she is getting relatively equal parts of both. I'm happy to have her R not deal only 100 damage in the early game. That's a pretty good thing overall. I think this damage scaling is fine for an ulti. This AP ratio is whatever. It's actually relatively aggressive, to be fair, for an ultimate. This means that Silas is actually pretty good at stealing Leona ulti, because this is a pretty good ratio overall. Not that it necessarily always matters, but it's one thing worth noting. It's just something that is in my mind, because I kind of care about how ults scale. Not that Leona really buys any ability power, but hey, by the way, that's there. Regardless, it is a mix of 50 more damage on R and 0 to 10 extra armor and MR on the ability that she maxes first. So a mix of more durability and a mix of more damage on Leona, both of which she accesses from level 4, 5, 6, 7, 9. Lucian is getting a 3-second cooldown buff on rank 1 of his E. One thing we are steering away from here on SRT Live Pod is caring as much about elo skew when it doesn't betray the point of the champion. So to me, Jinx is the kind of AD carry that I think should be low MMR skewed. Some of this is that she's the main character of Arcane, arguably. And so just like, that's just a relevant point about League of Legends ecosystem. There's a TV show with main characters, and guess what? Jinx is maybe the main one. Which means that, wow, I want to go play the main character of Arcane. She should be approachable. I actually went, if any of the old heads who played Warcraft 3, I know Grubby plays like Dota 2 and hot stuff as well, but like Grubby started playing League of Legends, and I think his literally first League of Legends game was on Jinx. I mean, yes, it's one of the starter champions that like the game shows you. Like, pick one of these like 4 champions, but also like his literally first ever PvP game was on Jinx. It's like, hey, you know, that's kind of cool. As a former Warcraft 3 player, I'm soft spot for Grubby. That guy's cool. Anyway, whatever. There's something there, right? I think that is like relevant, that like as like League of Legends, the game, the product, the thing that interacts with humans in the real world as like part of pop culture, some champions should be approachable, and some champions scream to you that they are high skill. I think Lucian is one of these champions that says, hey, this champion is high skill, he's high mastery, he's harder to play than most champions, he is less approachable, and he's really cool, and that's great. But it's the kind of thing where when you have a high skill champion, much like Azir and Ivern, you actually expect them to have elite skewed win rates, because challenger players play more league than silver players, so of course they're more practiced than the average champion, and lo and behold, Lucian has some elite skew. Now, also, Lucian is typically best when he's an early game champion. I think it's important that we have good lane bullies in League of Legends, and Lucian is one of those, and that is fine. That is part of his identity. That will also elite skew him. That is okay. We are not trying to be like, but Lucian's already a bit elite skewed, we're not allowed to do this. Nah, dude, you know what? Lucian's a little bit elite skewed. That's okay. If you're a silver player and you see that Lucian is a 46% win rate champion and low elo, I don't think the read is, wow, Lucian sucks. It's, oh yeah, Lucian's actually pretty hard to play. It requires more practice to be good at Lucian compared to being good at Misfortune. Because like, right, Misfortune has the opposite curve where she's like a 50% win rate champion in Elite with very little play rate overall relative to the fact that she's incredibly popular in low elo because she's easy to play and approachable. Great. That's a good thing for Misfortune. Wonderful. She's a relatively easy to play marksman who like pretty well telegraphs how you're supposed to play her, what you're supposed to do. Awesome. You know, successful champion, well designed, cool stuff. But that means that win rate where Misfortune goes up in silver has to go somewhere, and it goes down in silver for champions like Lucian, or maybe Kai'Sa, or Kalista, or Draven, and that's fine. So this is all to say, embracing the early game niche that is Lucian to make him an aggressive, high-octane lane bully. He has been successfully untethered from Nami. That is great. Now that he is no longer Projo and being tied to Nami, Lucian can be more powerful. We haven't had a Lucian meta that wasn't a Lucian Nami meta in multiple years. It would be cool to have Lucian back as a standalone cool champion. It's been a while. Honestly, the fact that he still isn't really around means his champion is probably just kind of weak, so we make him better. We make him better as a lane bully. We give him a strategic niche so that there is some. AD carries are pretty famously low context, so getting somewhere we can is nice. But a lot of the reason that the AD carry meta can centralize so easily is AD carries tend to be fairly contextless in the sort of in like a team comp perspective, and so having some more here is kind of nice. That allows us to have some more variation overall. Let's look at some of the numbers real quick. And this is the base equivalent of E before and after, equipped to level 13. It no longer matters anymore. And this is assuming that you're going to E auto, Q auto, W auto, and you're going to get 6 full hits on an enemy champion, and thus get 12 seconds off the cooldown. And you can see that the percentage difference there is much more meaningful when it's a 7-second cooldown instead of a 10-second cooldown. This lines up more closely with, you know, E auto combo, and then being able to do a second E relatively quickly, especially if your first item is something like Essence Reaver, or you get a couple more points into it, and you're, you know, if you're around here, and this is actually not even accounting for ability haste, like if you have like a Caulfield's Warhammer by like level, I don't know, 7 or something, you're doing this, like this is another, what, about 2 seconds off the cooldown, and so its 8 becomes 5, and that really is like, oh yeah, your second E is basically back up already. So this can be really, really impactful, especially on your first couple of recalls. So yeah, meant to be good. 2 changes to Mordekaiser. I know the meme is we keep buffing Mordekaiser Q, but to be fair, Mordekaiser Q is one of his skills with sort of the most gameplay, where it's moderately reliable. E is, of course, quite dodgeable. But Q is, Q is wave clear, Q is jungle clear speed, Q is only moderately dodgeable, so it's his ability to like baseline trade. This means he doesn't have to land the pull, because he doesn't have to rely on the passive and the E and staying in melee range and using, both has the passive, the auto attack, and the spinny bit. But it's saying, actually, yeah, my E is hard to land. I can at least land Qs on you. Q's pretty reliable. Cool, great. Or I can wave clear. Great. Also, the fact that Mordekaiser doesn't, I believe, have enough incentives to build ability power. His scaling falls off gold-wise. I would like to give Mordekaiser better gold scaling, and his worst AP ratio relative to its base damage is his Q, and it's not close. His passive auto damage is literally only a ratio and has no base damage. The spinny damage is actually a really aggressive AP ratio as well. The E is a very aggressive AP ratio, especially for its base damage. W doesn't have one, whatever. But Q is his worst AP ratio. It should arguably be his best one. Arguably. There's a debate there. Maybe it should be part of the passive. Whatever. Doesn't really matter that much. But it's like, yeah, his AP gold scaling is kind of bad, which means he doesn't feel gold. He doesn't feel good buying Riftmaker. Doesn't feel good buying Zonias. This kind of champion that should feel good buying AP items in slot 3 and 4 and 5, and not having to go Jack Show and having to go Thornmail and having to go things like Spirit Visage, but actually feeling good about building ability power. So trying to creep his AP up. I am down to go even harder on this, and maybe if it's like has to be win at negative, nerf some of the per level scaling to say, no, actually, you really should be building ability power. This ratio is good, get in there, buddy. Go feel good about this, right? The other change, though, is basically doing the Garen treatment to R, which is saying that, hey, Realm of Death now, when you start casting R, it puts a debuff on you, which is actually Mordekaiser R. A spell and a buff have the same name while being different things. The spell Mordekaiser R, when you start casting it, puts on the debuff Mordekaiser R on its target. And on live, Mordekaiser R is a slow, and that buff also handles the logic of playing the like green tether between Mordekaiser and his target. This now also puts reveal over your head. It puts a reveal over your head so that this buff now says, I'm not going to lose vision of you as I'm doing my fairly long cast animation pressing R. I already saw someone mentioned Cho'Gath should get this treatment. I agree. I think Cho'Gath R should also get this treatment. But I think, yeah, single target cast time ultis, I think, are deserving of being able to finish their cast times when it's a really high impact spell and it feels really, really bad to lose. Garen is this, I think Mordekaiser is this, and I think Cho'Gath is this, and so I'm happy to add it Cho'Gath here as well. But it's basically a ton of feels, not really that much power, but just ensures that you can finish casting your R unless they like immune it or something. We do have the numbers, by the way, on Obliterate. Let's do it. So this is his, this is just basically linear, not quite linear, but basically just interpolating his current live build. The most common one is Riley's demonic Jack Show Thornmail, and so it's only 2 AP items, and so of course it's only 2 AP items, you're only getting like a 1 to 5% more damage. His most common full AP build includes Riftmaker and Zonias, and so with a lot more ability power in the build, of course you can see the damage difference is much larger, to the tune of almost 7%. And if you really wanted to go Death Cap last slot, you could try, and you would add a bit more, or Cosmic Drive. Cosmic's probably too squishy for him, maybe the old Cosmic, whatever. But to say that, hey, yes, the buff is disproportionately better for high AP builds, okay, great, but if you just build the current live thing of only 2 AP items with Riley's Demonic, you still get a solid amount of extra damage on your primary damage spell, which is a good thing. Next is a set of changes to Kiana. We're trying to do 2 things at once here. One is to lower her reliance on tier. Fact of the matter is about 20% of all players finish Manamune when they play Kiana. The item does not appear to be very performant, so it seems that players are wrong when they buy it, but they still feel the need to buy it, aka they feel like her mana costs are too constraining. So we'd like to do both things here, which is 1, lower the dependency on tier by giving her more mana, but 2, actually letting Manamune be a better item by giving her more mana to multiply with Manamune. Manamune, much like the tank tier item, I'm pretty sure this one works this way. I know Mana does. Cares about your total mana, not just your bonus mana like Seraph's Embrace, which means a buff to a mana pool actually makes Mana a stronger item in terms of the amount of damage it provides. So let's talk about the math here. This is just the simple base mana of Kiana herself. She has about 15% to 20% more mana. Now keep in mind that mana regen is not accounted for here, so you have to cut this by, not percentage points, but by about 30% if you're going to count for mana regen as well. Keep in mind she also tends to run Presence of Mind. That is another reason to cut the mana down a little bit here. So the actual impact is not quite as big as it looks like on paper. Though still meaningful, it's still an extra 1 to 2 spells in the early game and an extra 4 to 5 spells in the mid to late game, which is, I think, very effective and will help her feel a lot better. Next thing, though, is actually doing a lot of the math, which is how much bonus damage on your Q does a finished Muramana do. This is the fact that because she has more base mana, the total mana to bonus AD ratio has increased. As well as because she has more total mana, the percent total mana on spell hit has increased. And so this is doing both the spell hit damage and using the total AD to factor into the fact that Q has a 75% AD ratio, and so putting that one in as well. And so the total amount of bonus damage that Muramana gives to your Q is up by, if you were to somehow finish this item at level 6, which is not possible, so this is kind of fake, but we'll start maybe around here, these are getting 6 to 11 extra damage per Q because of this change. Now, even if you went Muramana, you might still have so you get a little bit here in terms of the mana pool, but you also get 6% more damage contribution from Muramana, and this would probably be true for other abilities as well. Because of the mana pool increase. Again, this is not the total damage of Q is up by 6%, but the total bonus damage provided by Muramana is up by 6%. And so Muramana, the item, is about 6% stronger, which, yeah, pretty good thing overall. Hopefully a reasonable amount of buffs to Kiana herself. Small QOL stuff for Talon. He now gets the attack reset no matter what, whether it's in melee range or in dash range. Cool thing there. I saw a suggestion around how melee Q takes longer than the dash. That is actually a pretty good point. This, I think, will probably not be in 24B, but is a pretty good idea, something that we could do to say, hey, all of your Qs are as fast as the dash. Maybe it's just you always dash or something, and we, do what we need to do to make this all make sense. But, a pretty reasonable suggestion overall. Anyway, mostly just QOL here for our boy Talon. Vel'Koz gets a couple of bug fixes. So the first half of W would fail if he died before it exploded, and the E would fail if he was knocked back out of range before the missile spawned, as well as the fact that if he E flashes, it will spawn from the old location. This means he can't E flash forward. Not that that would really do anything, because it's a fixed... a fixed travel time missile no matter what, but I guess it'll just look maybe more consistent. This doesn't really have any meaningful gameplay impact though, but of course this could have failed once in a while, and of course this could fail once in a while, and both those feel bad, so good changes to Vel'Koz overall to fix a couple of bugs. Zeri, I mentioned her. I did kind of misspeak. I called her an infinite scaler. This is hyperbole. This is meant to be. Zeri is a hyperscaler in her current form of League of Legends. Ultimately, because Zeri has very, very bad growth stats overall, and this was largely done to try to make her worse at using Sheen, but now she just can't use Sheen anymore. I think it's good if Zeri gets to a spot where she has fairly normal marksman growth stats, and then that is compensated for by probably having less gold growth overall, so that Zeri is less of a funnel champion and more of a conventional marksman who happens to be highly mobile. I think that is a much... I don't think Zeri needs to have a hyper carry niche. She is the fastest marksman, and that is more than enough, I believe. And I have had conversation with August. He actually agrees. This is not to be I'm smart, look at me, I'm really cool, but it's yeah, I think it is pretty wise that Zeri moves in a direction of having pretty normal scaling relative to other marksmen, and this is at least a nudge in this direction. So attack damage growth is up, and it's still going to be low for a conventional marksman. That's fine. Just noting that, of course, it is. This is fairly low for conventional marksman. Okay, whatever. And then also Ultra Shock Laser, by putting more of her power into the W, this again says, well, relative to Zeri's total power, if Ultra Shock Laser is more of her total power budget, this means that she is less of a hyper carry. She has some poke, she has some things she can do. If she's set behind and isn't having a very good game, okay, well, here's some base damage, here's some poke, here's a set of utility you can provide, you can do this thing and be useful. And, like, this is going to save the game. She's not something going to become Ashe or Jhin, where she's there for the crowd control. But I am a fan of nudging this up where possible to say that, like, hey, if Darius is having a really bad game, Flash Apprehend can still be a game-winning play. If Camille's having a really bad game, you know, there's still the E2 Flash R to engage and find something to do. And that is useful for every champion to have something to do when you're having a horrible game and it's like, I can't do anything. It's like, well, I've still got something that is either repeatable or a high moment that is more reliable, to say that even having a bad game, I have something I can do. Of course, every champ needs to have performance with gold. This is going to change per champ and per class, but for a champion like Zeri, and I think for marksman largely as a whole, saying you're a little bit more consistent and you're a little bit less gold funnely as a class, I think is a good thing for League of Legends. And Zeri's moving in this direction, which I think is a good thing for Zeri specifically. Like, I would not want to make Ashe more about utility in the incredible short term. Like, I'm not about to do this here, but I think for Zeri it makes total sense, and I think we can even go further. Regardless, let's do some math. This is accounting for a typical item build. This is roughly how much damage Zeri Q will do, not counting for crits. Doesn't matter. Crits are going to multiply this like perfectly cleanly anyway. But via the extra attack damage growth, here is roughly how much damage comes out of Zeri Q. And it's actually a pretty meaningful amount here, right? If, you know, autoing is most of Zeri's damage, let's say it's 2/3. And the rule of thumb I still have is that roughly 1% more damage is 0.5% win rate, then we're somewhere in the world of, yeah, this is maybe 1.5% win rate to Zeri overall. We can, you know, add some decimal points. Like, yeah, it's 3 and change. You know, a lot of the game is played, you know, after level 10 or so, especially like relative to her total power budget. So yeah, you know, a solid 1% or so win rate, of course. And then here is the total damage of her W. This accounts for both the 10 base damage increase, which you can see here, but also the fact that as she gets more attack damage growth, this ability has a 1.3 attack damage ratio that, well, as she gets more total attack damage, is going to, of course, factor into the W as well. And so her W is doing a substantial amount more damage. Of course, W is a pretty small amount of her damage output, maybe like 10-15%, somewhere around there. But hey, if 10% of her damage is up by 8%, that's, you know, almost 1% more damage to the champion. It's a little bit of win rate. It's not a ton. This is not a huge lever here, but it matters some. It gives her something to do. And it's a little bit of extra self-reliance, non-funnel power in Zeri, which is good. If your support's griefing, if you're getting turbo dive, you know, 1v5, you're typically going to get relatively normal amounts of XP, even if you are losing a lot of gold because you don't have to wave or whatever. And so a little bit, you know, better situations for Zeri there overall. As mentioned, ranked season going to be ending January 9th at midnight. And then the split is going to start at noon the next day. I guess a little bit special timing for LATAM and North America. Arena is coming back. There is a lot going on here. I'm not going to delve through all of Arena, but there are just an absolute ton of changes on Arena. One thing I just kind of wanted to point out is that since we have the tech now to individually tune abilities pretty trivially across modes, it's actually very easy to do. One thing that I had done anytime I worked on champions was basically you have to set up the abilities in a specific way to allow this to be easy to do. It's not hard to do. You have to go and actually edit the scripts as well as edit the like baseline data file for the champions. So like when I made Janna edits a while back, I did this as well, to her passive Q, W, and E. And so, hey, for the Arena folks, right, when they're coming in and making changes to champions, it meant that like, hey, there was like a little bit I'm just going to scroll up to Janna because I'm sure she has. Wow. There are no Janna changes. Janna has no bespoke changes in Arena. Okay, that's actually really kind of funny to me. I set up Janna passive Q, W, and E to be able to be manually tuned in Arena, and they don't have any specific Janna changes in Arena. It's really funny. It's not a lot of extra work, but like, I think it's actually really funny that I went and did this specifically, and it doesn't matter at all. Okay, that's a minor thing there. Anyway, I wanted to bring up a bug fix that was in... there's a lot of item changes here as well. There's just so much in for Arena, which is cool. That's good. Bug fixes. I could have just Control F, and I didn't. Oh, I actually really like this. This is really cool. We have separated gameplay bug fixes from cosmetic bug fixes. I actually really like this. It's actually really, really sweet. So that we can actually read through the ones that we think have, more likely. What am I trying to say? Yeah, so you're catch the ones that it might actually impact the game in a more meaningful way. So Draven, our sub-execute is gone. There is a weird bug around Zai's empowered auto attacks sticking into a target who is dashing. Morgana W inside a train is good, of course. Yeah, so this is the one that I fixed. This is why I went down here. I'd gotten out of the habit of talking about the bugs that I fixed, more just because it's interesting to tell the story. So the reason this happened, and actually to be clear, I think Rod of Ages, by the way, does work correctly. The bug with Rod of Ages is Rod of Ages Ornn upgrade is actually that the tracker didn't show, but it actually worked correctly. But Ginsu's Rageblade actually was bugged. So the way Ginsu's works under the hood, and this is probably the more reasonable way of doing this, is when you have Rage Knife or Ginsu's Rageblade, or Arena's Rageblade, or Seething Sorrow, which is Ornn's Rageblade, or Arena's Seething Sorrow, which is Arena's Ornn's Rageblade, right? Those are all five different items, right? They are distinct items. And they all have the Rageblade passive. There's like a Rageblade buff, and that handles all of them. So they all have one unified set of logic, which is correct. So like if you ever needed to like change some numbers, it makes it really, really easy and kind of future-proof to say, okay, well, these items all work the same. They'll all use the same buff, and that's fine. Essentially, human error happened, and the way that these items work is because Rage Knife doesn't give you Phantom Hit, but the other 4 items do, the Rageblade buff needs to say, hey, by the way, which item do I own? Do I own Rage Knife? Do I own Rageblade? Do I own Seething Sorrow? Do I own, whatever? Okay, based on that, I need to say, by the way, when I max stat, give me Phantom Hit, right? And basically for human error reasons, Summoner's Rift Seething Sorrow was not on that list as of patch like 13.13. And so unfortunately it's been this way for 10 patches. I'm sorry, I didn't catch it, right? I could have fixed this. It was actually relatively easy because I re-added logic that I added in 13.10 when we made the item, right? And we put in Seething Sorrow into the game. So, right, I could have caught it. I could have caught the bug sooner. Either way, at least we fixed it here. Anyways, to say that basically it was just like, oh yeah, we just need to add Seething Sorrow back on the list to say, yes, if I have Seething Sorrow, I need to say that, yes, I will have Phantom Hit. And so that is now back in. That is back toggled on. Yes, it's a relatively easy fix. Could honestly have been done sooner. Again, my bad. I could have caught it. Regardless, that was that change. And that's the patch. Relatively short rundown. We got it under an hour. I don't really feel like doing a TLDR. I think these changes were relatively straightforward. So thanks for watching, everyone. See you next time. Bye-bye.